Right, grade 10s. I want us to look at transformations in Southern Africa. So, normally you would do general history until the end of term 2, and then we would write that off in a June exam. But it's not normal now. So, we think that we will probably maybe still at the end of the year write on French Revolution perhaps, or some other sections from term 1 and 2. We don't know. But in the meantime, we're going to move on to transformations in Southern Africa. And I've given you this note. It's on the D6 and I sent it to you. This note tells you what to do. This is the important one. Number 2, the things you must do. And then number 1, the pages you must read. And then here is just an explanation of what the Mafekan is. Okay? Now I know I pronounce Mafekan terribly. I pronounce it phonetically, so that we know how to spell it when we write about it. So have a laugh, and then we move on with that, okay? And you'll see there's just an explanation of the period on that note that I've put out. But the main notes, this is your to-do list and your to-read list. The main notes of this note that I handed out at the beginning of the year, it says transformations in Southern Africa. That one you need. That one's very useful, especially this piece, just this piece, okay? And then I also gave you that one. Don't worry about that one for now, but have it on hand. Okay, so that's the material we're using. Now let's go back to my summary for today. So we're looking at transformations in Southern Africa. So I want to point out something to you. Transformations means changes, right? Changes. And we say Southern Africa. Why don't we say South Africa with a capital S? Because we don't become a country, South Africa, in 1750. That comes later. So in about 1750, there wasn't a country. There were colonies and there were chiefdoms, and later there'd be kingdoms. There were groupings of people. So we weren't a country, so we were geographically at the bottom of Africa, the south of Africa. So we speak about Southern, small letter, Africa. Right, so when we do this section of work, then we need an overview of what was happening in that period. Then we can look at the Mafekan, and that's mainly from the notes, but I've actually skipped that for now. So yes, it falls under the overview, but there's a set of notes in here that covers different causes of the Mafekan, and I've left that for now. I've jumped to something that's easier, okay? So don't stress about that. Then we look at changes. So what are the basic changes? I'm going to cover that now. And then I've jumped to Shaka Zulu. It's source-based, and it's looking at what his legacy is and what did he do. So it fits in with Mafekan because he operated within that time frame. But I just want to leave that out for a while. I want to go to that because I'm choosing the easiest bits first, although it can look quite hard in the beginning. Okay, so let's go through that again if you got confused. Southern Africa, not South Africa. We're going to do a little overview. We're going to jump where the notes gives us lots of reasons, and the textbooks go into a lot of details about different groupings of people. We're going to skip some of that. We're going to be looking out for changes, but we're going to look at Shaka Zulu's role in those changes. So it's source-based in terms of Shaka Zulu's role and what were the changes. Okay, so now we've got that under wraps. Let's look at changes then. So that table that I told you about, let me show you again. It's very useful to understand the changes. So if we jump to here again, in 1750 versus in 1850, so whatever happens between here is the changes, or big word, transformations. Okay, so in 1750, there were mainly Iron Age settlements. So we call them Iron Age because they were using iron at that stage. But by 1850, there's no more Iron Age settlement, okay? In 1750, there's small-scale independent chiefdoms. You see, they're chiefs. So you've got a chief, you've got a village, and you've got people who owe loyalty to the chief. So it's small groupings of people scattered around Southern Africa. And then you've got small groups of white settlements, particularly along the coast, Cape Town area, maybe a little bit Port Elizabeth area, is London, not even yet, maybe PE, not even yet. It's going to start to happen. But you've got Cape Colony and Natal, so Durban area. Okay, so very small white settlement and small chiefdoms, okay, and it's called an Iron Age. By 1850, the geography and the history and the lifestyle and so much has changed in South African history. So those chiefdoms get overwhelmed by other groupings. There's warfare, there's fleeing, there's movement of people, and so people group together into larger states. Either they were overtaken by a stronger ethnic group that attacked them, or they fled and joined another group for security reasons. They joined another group and they became a large state. Okay, some of those were called kingdoms. So either it's called a large state or it's called a kingdom. And in fact, Lesotho, for example, is an example of an area where the Sotho went and settled there, and it became a large state, and it's still an independent country with surrounded by South Africa. But we're particularly focused on the rise of the Zulu kingdom because we want to see what role Shaka Zulu played in this Zulu kingdom coming into being. So they say that maybe Shaka Zulu, now some people dispute that Mfecane even happened, or how it happened, or who was to blame. But they say that there was this movement of people. There were people who were fleeing, there were people who were moving, and that it ultimately played a role in the history of South Africa, that there was fleeing and movement. The debatable part is, was it Shaka Zulu's fault? Was it other factors? And I can tell you already that there were many, many factors involved. Yes, Shaka Zulu played a role, but there was a drought. And so people moved to different areas to seek grazing for their cows, okay? And one of the largest reasons for this change was that colonization took place. So ultimately, there were just a few white settlements, and we're going to see that that colonization spread. So for example, in 1838, there was a great trek, and former Dutch people raced into the interior in the ox wagons, and they took over new areas. And so what we see is that the white area moves into the interior, and we'll talk about that extensively in this period. But so we see a change in black chiefdoms becoming states. We see a change in white settlement, mainly along the coast, to being into the interior. Okay, so you'll see that table in the notes that I spoke about, and then that is elaborated on there. Okay, very good. Now the next thing that we can look at is what the Mfecane was. It was movement, change, dispersion of people. It might have been Shaka Zulu's as a cause, possibly, but we know that actually there were a lot of reasons. And the important words that we need to look out for is that competition over trade and land. So remember, when the white man came, he upset the natural harmony of life in Southern Africa, because chiefs that used to get along with each other or mind their own business or do their own thing were suddenly competing against each other, particularly for the trade of elephant tusks. And so suddenly they're competing against each other, whereas they had been living in harmony. And we see power struggles emerge because of that. Okay, as a matter of interest, the white man brought guns which had not been used in African society, in African warfare. So I touched on that with slavery, where warfare became more intense. And so that's quite scary to think that power struggles between Africans was to a large degree motivated by weapons that white people put into African people's control, and that trade that they wanted would lead to power struggles within that community. So it upsets the harmony that there'd been in Africa. Okay, so let's take a look then. We've discussed an overview of the changes. We've just touched on the Mfecane, and there is more of it in the notes. And then now we're going to look at Shaka Zulu. So when we look at Shaka Zulu, we are looking at a little bit about his story. Who was he? How did he influence? How did he grow the Zulu kingdom? And then we're looking at what its impact was in Southern Africa. So some people see him as a symbol of Zulu greatness, and other people say that he's not a symbol of Zulu greatness. He used terrible violence and cruelty towards people, and so you get these two opposite views on him. Now, we have a problem in history because we base our things on primary sources. And so when it comes to evaluating Zulu, we have to be careful, because a lot of what was written about Shaka was written by missionaries who lived in the area to spread Christianity. And some of them wanted to sell books. And the way to sell a book is to make your main character a villain. And so we have a lot of biased primary sources about Zulu kingdom's greatness, and those biased sources portray Shaka Zulu in a certain way, but it is biased in order to sensationalize, in order to sell books. And so we have to question this violence and cruelty in relation to the reliability of a source that we see about Shaka Zulu. Right, so what are some of the things that Shaka did? He arranged everyone into age regiments. And so if you were young, you were in a certain age regiment, and then you owed him loyalty because you were in that age regiment, and then he would provide you with land. But because he's going to provide you with land, he actually has to keep acquiring land so that when you retire from military service, he can allocate you the land that he is honor bound to do so. Right, he introduced the idea of using the shield to protect you further. He introduced intense training for his troops, and he changed the look of the spear that was used, making it more effective. And then we want to look at his bullhorn formation. So this is very clever. He would put a group here. There's the enemy. And then unbeknown to the enemy, he had his younger, fastest impis running along the sides like the horns of a bull. And before that enemy knew it, they were surrounded by these young, fit guys. And they were keeping their eye on the enemy there and not realizing that the enemy was surrounding them. So that is why we say that he was a military strategist with great military precision. And so we praise him for the innovations he brought into structuring his society and then the different techniques that he used. Right. So have a look over here. So what we see is that white people were mainly in the Cape. They were mainly in the Natal. Shaka Zulu then starts gathering together different groups here, and we see the rise of a Zulu kingdom. And as he attacks a group, they either become part of the Zulu kingdom or maybe they flee and they go and settle somewhere else. So some of them went as far as the present-day Zimbabwe, for example. Okay, so you've got, and then the Lesotho group that formed there. So either you're going to flee or you're going to join the Zulu kingdom, and the Zulu kingdom is going to get bigger and bigger. Right. But now the thing is that in terms of white people, they are wanting to trade with different groups, and that's causing different groups to have conflict between them over the trade. So they speak about Delagoa Bay, which we'd say would be more or less, somewhere in present-day Mozambique. And that is one of the areas that there was trading happening with. Okay, so the white people are wanting to trade from these positions. That's going to cause conflict with the local people. And then we see that white people start pushing into the interior and taking more and more land. And I've mentioned the Great Track, where the trackers didn't want to be under British control, and so they moved into the interior wanting to take over land. So one of the things that we must look out for is an empty land myth. And that is the notion that people believed that they were settling in areas that were empty. And so they would argue that they didn't dispossess people of their land. The land was empty. But the reality could well be that it was empty temporarily because this group had fled conflict, but they were intending to come back. But when they came back, there was a little thatched house and a fence and a little Afrikaner farm that had been set up. And so the empty land myth then is this idea of when white people settled into the interior, they may have been mistaken into believing that nobody was there, so it was fine. But either that group had fled or had been moving around because of grazing and looking for grazing with the intention of returning to that ancestral home. And so that sets up a confusing situation in Southern African history. And it speaks to a whole issue of land dispossession and the controversy around it at present. And this gives us an interesting insight into some of those ideas. Right, so that is transformations in South Africa. Now, I want to remind you that we're focusing on Shaka Zulu. So you'll see here, I've given you a whole lot of activities to do. They are mainly about an overview of this period and then mainly about Shaka Zulu, because we can be pretty confident that if we write an exam on Southern African history, one of the questions could be Shaka Zulu and what his role was. And it's a fascinating section of history. So don't stress about the bits and the pieces and the pages that I've left out. You'll see I've jumped from page to page. Just focus on understanding the overview, looking out for changes, and then focusing on Shaka Zulu. Right, remember, you are smart and you are loved.